The problem we currently have with the bindings we have created is that they are binding to a single property and to a single source of information. What do I mean by this? Imagine that you need to create multiple bindings from C# code to different controls properties. Well, what you would have to do is replicate what we did with these lines multiple times. This could cause confusion in the code. Fortunately, in .NET Maui, you can set a common source of information for a graphic user interface element called binding context. Let's see it in action. Each of these controls that are part of .NET Maui have a property called binding context available. For example, if we access to a control called txt_name, we see the property called binding context, which can be set to take an information source, and you can get the different properties from the information source without having to create a specific binding. This way, we could indicate that the origin of information for this control called txt_name was the instance of the person directly. What we would have to do in case we wanted to do this from C# code is to establish the binding through this way. But as we do not have a binding previously created, we will indicate which is going to be the property from which we are going to take the information, which in this case will be the property name. The source of information would be the instance of the person, and the property that we want to bind is the property called name to the text property of the txt_name control. Let's test the change that we have made. For it, I'm going to return to the XAML code. I'm going to make a copy of this label control. I'm going to unassign the text property of the label control, and let's test the application to see how it behaves. Here we have the application. I press the button click, and already we see again the text that indicates which is the name obtained through the binding. Now we can go one step further, since a binding context is inherited from a container control to the contained elements. That is to say, we could assign a binding context to a page or a layout so that all the controls inside it have the same data source. How can we do this? Well, let's go back to the code behind. Let's proceed to comment this pair of lines one more time. And as part of this page, let's access the binding context property and assign the instance of the person. With this, automatically, all the controls that are part of this content page would have access directly to the properties of the data source. With this, we will simplify even more the amount of lines, leaving only this line in the C# code. What we have to continue doing is to specify which is going to be the property of the control to which we are going to assign the data source, and which is going to be the origin property from which we are going to take that information. To do this, we return to the XAML code, and as part of the label control, we will replicate what we did from the C# code, indicating first what is the bindable property, which in this case is the text property. Let's indicate once again that we want to create a bind to the property called name, which will be obtained from the data source that we established in this line. With this, we already have the three components that are part of a binding: the data source, which is the bindable property to which we're going to bind, and which is the property from which we will take the information. Let's test the application. Let's click on the button and see how everything continues working correctly. Finally, let's proceed to copy this label control a couple more times, and we're going to bind the other properties for each of these controls. So we're just going to indicate that we're going to bind to a property called phone and a property called address. Now we're going to have a problem here because we have the same name for each of the controls. The great advantage of using data binding is that we no longer need to be establishing names for each one of the controls to access from the code behind to each one of them, unless it is really necessary. Therefore, we can remove the name of each one of the controls and everything would still work correctly. Let's test the application. We already have here the three properties that have been assigned to the controls, and we have a code that has been quite clean. With this, we have learned the principles of data binding.